going, everybody? Welcome back to the Thursday local show. It's exciting. I had a really good conversation yesterday with Carlos Cardona, so I want everybody to go check that out. Also, last week there was a stream with Keene Sentinel reporter Paul Kuna-Booth, and that one is, I really encourage people to check that out because it goes deep into actual perspective on local journalism and the way journalists look at it, or at least some. So I just want to sort of plug some previous streams because I think it's important that people check that out. I've been really elated to have just awesome guests lately that are sharing tons of information, deep dives, and it's been great. So definitely take a minute to subscribe on YouTube, support us on Patreon, follow us on social networks like Facebook and Twitter. But today, I'm super, super excited to announce that I'll be joined by Anna McGuiness, who's gaining a lot of profile here in Peterborough and the Monadnock region, the ConVal School District. She's a very outspoken activist and has shared a lot of very salient points about what is needed for students and youth in this area, and sort of the way that intersects with the broader activist movement that's happening right now, just sort of in the region and in the country for that matter. So right now I'm going to bring on Anna. Anna, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's a total pleasure. How's your summer going?
It's interesting. Not exactly what I expected.
Yeah, I can relate to that. I definitely have found myself trying to sort of navigate new challenges. Last night, actually, I attended there's a housing task force in Peterborough. Right, and it's been going for about a year now. And last night was sort of like we're like tabling the committee for the time being because it had sort of become apparent that we were like not getting where we needed to go, and that was a frustrating conversation. As somebody might, like right now, I'm looking for sort of a better housing arrangement. I don't know if people know this. Like I broadcast this show from a studio apartment. And it's not ideal when your bedroom and your kitchen and your workspace are all the same location. So, and that's probably something that like I think students can relate to living with their parents, and like you guys only have so much space, and so yeah, not the best. But so today, I mean, like you have done a lot of speaking out about the condition of mental health at ConVal and just what's available or not available. So we're both graduates, and there's also like over a decade between our when we graduated. But I just keep getting this feeling like not a whole lot has changed. Maybe some things have, but others haven't, especially in the way of mental health services. And I just kind of want to compare notes with you on that gap, and definitely have you lead the discussion because I think your memory of it is obviously a lot more fresh than mine. But sort of like, I'm wondering obviously there's no mental health counselor there, but like what are some of the analogs to it potentially, or what sort of rough support was there when you were there? What would you have wanted specifically to be available to you while you were there? So yeah, I mean, if you want to just sort of take it from there and see like what, let's just hash it out.
Yeah. So to be clear, on and off, there is a school psychologist at ConVal, which is, I think, a real psychologist, a licensed psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
One of the issues I have that I actually wrote down in my notes is that the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had no idea how you would make an appointment with that school psychologist. I know that students would go. I knew some students who I would see going in and out of that office. But as a student who had mental health issues, I thought, how would I have gotten access to that office? And I
Yeah.
actually legitimately had no idea
Yeah.
who I would go to even start that process.
Right.
The closest I could even come to is that I would go to my guidance counselor who I scheduled classes with and just tell them that I was having problems and
Yeah.
hope that they would do something, but that seems desperately inappropriate,
Yeah.
as far as the process goes.
That was so, and I was gonna say, like, for my experience, that was absolutely what it was like. I mean, I don't even think we even had a licensed psychologist on site at the time. So I remember, like, me and other peers, if we were having trouble, like, we would have to go to our college guidance counselors, the people that were like helping us figure out where we wanted to go to school and what we needed, and just be like, oh, I got a vent, like, and that was, it's like, I really appreciated that. I appreciated that, like, availability that those guidance counselors offered, but at the same time, like, that's not what their job was. And we were like walking in and trying to have them do that work. Or if you're like going to the nurse's office and you're like sort of relying on the nurse to be like, yeah, okay, you can hang out here for a few hours and just chill and be out of class and not have to deal with that insanity. And that was the closest that we had when I was there. And so I think I'm wondering if that's changed at all, but apparently it's not that much.
No, I mean, the biggest note, like the word I have really big here is turnover, because the school psychologist changed multiple times just in my time there. And talking to students now, I'm of the understanding that the school psychologist that was there my senior year is no longer there.
Wow.
There were periods where we didn't have a school psychologist because they were searching for a new one. There were periods where I didn't know who the school psychologist was because they were always in their office, and so I didn't see them at
Right.
all. And it was a new person. And so we had other sort of officials that were, I didn't know what their licensing was. There's a lot of different licenses that you can have. You can be a licensed mental health counselor, you can be a licensed clinical social worker. And so we had people, I don't think it's maybe appropriate to name them. I could just like say their names, like who they were to me, but they were these people that they would say, oh, if you're having a mental health issue, you should go see this woman in this office. And it was always a woman. You should go see this woman in this office. But I never knew what their licensing was. I never knew what their qualifications were. And oftentimes it was really just no better than going to the nurse's office to chill out for a little bit. It was exactly the same as that. It just wasn't a nurse. It was like a woman whose job it was to chill out with you for 20 minutes, and then you were sent back to class.
Yeah. And I mean, and I think that's like, it's like, obviously it's good to be able to let students have space to, to separate themselves in that situation, but it doesn't actually, like, there's no talking through anything. And there's, and to your point about turnover, it's like, okay, yeah, but how do you have consistent and really effective services when year to year that person is changing? And it's not like, I like a professional therapist can sort of say like, okay, I've got too many patients. You know what I mean? Like, a school psychologist doesn't necessarily have that control measure, right? Like, because it's all the students all the time. And if you only have one person in that position, they're really kind of like restricted in how much time and energy they can sink into any one given thing, because it's like, I have to attend to the entire student body, and I never know at any time how many students could be requiring my services. For all they know, it could be literally every single student, because high school is a painful time in anybody's life. And we're all just trying to sort of figure ourselves out. So like, did you have counselors that were able to kind of like talk that through with you at all? I mean, like a guidance counselor, say, were they able to take a candid one? And again, you don't have to give their name, obviously, but were they ever able to take sort of like a candid moment and be like, yeah, here's my experience and here's what I went through, and I relate to you? Like, was there that conversational aspect ever?
I know there's one woman who worked at the school, I think for my freshman and sophomore years. And she was not a regular college guidance counselor. She had some sort of maybe social work qualifications. Again, I never really was aware of what exactly they were. She was a very excellent sort of figure at the school. She would really sit down and have real conversations with kids. She was pretty well liked and would have actual conversations about mental health. But she no longer works at ConVal. She left ConVal. I don't know what her position was, even the name of it. There's a lot of, one of the biggest issues I think is lack of transparency, which is put up for the sake of what a lot of people would call privacy, for students' privacy. You know, they want students to feel that they have privacy when they go to see these people. But what that creates is stigma and barriers towards seeing these people. You don't know what they do, so you don't want to go see them. You don't know who they are or why they do what they do. And so it's, oh, the weird kids go to see so and so, and none of us know what goes on in that office. It creates this very weird aura around the whole mental health department at ConVal.
Yeah, so it's funny because, like, I mean, to go back to sort of like the note comparison aspect of it, like, I remember that being a component. Like, if you saw a peer in the guidance counselor office, because I remember the way it was like there were several different guidance counselors sort of lined up in their offices on the left when you walked into the sort of administration room there. And if you would run into other students walking through that hallway, it's not like a traditional therapist where you sort of have like a screened off area where you're not really seeing other patients and you're not exposed to like the other folks that are going to get that service. But here it's like, it's right out in front. There's literally a space accommodation issue where you have to, like, you literally have to run into your peers, and then people are sort of like, whether consciously or not, judging that or trying to figure out like, oh, I wonder what they're in there for, or like, why is that person going to see the guidance counselor, especially if that student is like just experienced something super emotional, like I myself was that student at times. I knew other students that like I would run into them and I could see clearly they were having a really hard time, and I'm exposed to their struggle in that moment, but I don't know what's going on. So I'm aware that there's a problem in the school, but I don't know, like, you know what I mean? Like, it's a weird moment that does feel like a breach of privacy. And so to that end, what would you have suggested that they do as a way to sort of like mitigate that as much as possible? I know that it's hard, and space and arrangement is sort of a big component of that. But yeah, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I know in general, there are a couple of rooms that at one point, one of the counselors who was specifically for mental health had that was completely separate from the college guidance department.
Mm-hmm.
That was absolutely ideal. There were other times where the mental health guidance was the same room or adjacent rooms to college guidance. That was never, in my opinion, okay. Having those departments combined,
right,
should never happen. Like, I should never be going for guidance about panic attacks in the same rooms that I'm going for guidance about college applications.
Yeah.
I think there should never be a time at ConVal where students don't have an official in place for mental health. I understand that personnel turnover is a thing, but if you don't have backups, if you only have one person and you're not ready to replace that person, I mean, you're putting students in danger.
Yeah.
It's just true. And the fact that ConVal didn't have licensed mental health counselors, social workers, real psychologists, that a lot of the times I think they just had guidance counselors that they pretended were licensed mental health counselors to the student body. Not to accuse ConVal of anything. I don't think they were lying to us.
Right.
I think they just dressed up someone with regular guidance counselor qualifications who had maybe taken classes about meditation, mental health in general. You know, you can take classes that give you stamps on your license, but you're still just a regular guidance counselor at the end of the day. You're not,
it's just like basic training type stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. You're no different than the guy that I go see to register for my classes. But they
Right.
told us that they were. And to me, it's misleading.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think, I mean, it's funny. It's like the questions that I had sent you ahead of this. I feel like there's going to be some sort of intermingling between them. But it's like, to me, I hear that and I think, well, geez, I wonder how much rate of pay plays a factor in turnover rate. Like,
Mhm.
like I know that we don't necessarily pay teachers enough for what they do. Like, you can definitely earn a living. You can be, you can have a married couple that's two public school teachers and they can like just sort of, hit the workforce housing earning level in this area. But that's also not like, not necessarily enough to really like justify the work that's actually being done and the level of commitment and the level of education that that person needs to go through in order to actually effectively do that job. And not to mention, it doesn't account for the again, the increased amount of demand that's placed on those workers, like, because it's easy to think about teachers or guidance counselors or whatever in this sort of like this context, like within the school when we're, having a discussion about what students need, but we also have to remember that they're actually part of a labor force
Mhm.
and that it is a working class job and those pressures also apply to them.
Mhm.
So, but I want to sort of like, I want to switch gears a little bit on this. And because this is something that like I have wanted to discuss with somebody from a generation younger than me for a while now, which is, how would you describe the impact of cell phones and social media on the experience of just getting through high school right now? My generation, we did have cell phones, but they were just regular, like we were using QWERTY to text, you know what I mean? And like we had AOL Instant Messenger, but it wasn't even kind of what we have now. Facebook was still, like when I was in high school, Facebook was still pretty much locked up to just college students. It hadn't even been open to the general public, and like Twitter was just kind of getting rolling, and a lot of people thought it was dumb, so they didn't use it, or or whatever. And we just didn't have smartphones yet. And I hear people from my generation constantly saying like, oh yeah, well, we grew up with the internet too. We knew what it was like. And the reality is we don't, because they're not comparable experiences because of the proliferation of that technology. Right. And I, I'm just, I'm curious to sort of hear a candid take on the way that affected things.
Yeah, I took a bunch of notes about this because my friends and I have actually been talking about this a lot recently. Um, Sorry, my dad just said something.
You're good.
Um, uh, there he is. So ConVal had a bunch of cell phone policies that were designed to essentially curb cell phone addiction. Cell phone addiction is a huge problem at ConVal, or it was. I would say that it is. And they had these bins that you had to put your cell phone in at the beginning of class, or you had to keep it in your backpack. You're not allowed to have your phone in class at ConVal. That's how it was when I was there. I assume that it's similar now. But they also required you to carry around a Chromebook all of the time. You had to have a laptop that was given to you by the school. And so, as much as you weren't allowed to have your personal screen, you had to have a school screen, which to me was incredibly hypocritical because they wanted you to be technology literate, they wanted you to be internet literate, but only in a way that was school sanctioned. And I honestly spent so much time on a screen all of the time, but it was the school screen instead of my. It didn't make any sense to me because I didn't want to be on the screen. I wanted to be reading a book in class. I wanted to be doing work, paying attention, but instead I had to be focused in on a Google Doc or something, which is also horrible for me for other reasons because I get migraines, which is why I'm wearing the little yellow glasses. But
that is a real thing. Just like that, like the actual effect of looking at screens on our physical beings, um,
mm,
and having to just be exposed. So yeah, please continue.
but my like whole big point is that my friends and I have been talking about how cell phone and computer access from a young age, no matter how careful you are, it traumatizes you, like point blank. You
Hmm.
can be an excellent parent who only gives your kid YouTube kids and Netflix kids. It will traumatize you. If you have a phone, if you have access to google.com, at some point it will traumatize you. We were talking about how in middle school we would go on YouTube and you just scroll through your recommended and you end up watching like guys falling off cliff compilation on accident or something
Right.
like that, right?
Yeah.
And you're 12 years old and you don't know what it is, but what you're watching is videos of people dying,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And it's legal, it's on the internet all of the time, and you
Yeah.
kind of tell yourself that that's not what it is, but you see it all of the time. And my generation, more than any other generation previously, is exposed constantly to violence, videos, real footage of it, and then people attacking each other on the internet.
Yeah.
Just you can like just read text on Twitter of people being terrible,
Right.
all of it. And now everybody can see that. But I grew up at age 11. I could open up my phone and see that. And it
Mhm.
changes the way your brain works when you're exposed to it at age 11 instead of starting with it at age 40.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Or even for me at like age whatever it was, like 18, 20. You know what I mean? Like there was a certain amount of mental development that I was able to go through leading up to that. And I had a recent conversation about sort of like uh I mean, as a white guy, right? Like the problems that we encountered with sort of like the advent of the internet and the way that sort of promoted like the early days of inceldom, um, and how it was like it all of a sudden, if we didn't have a way, like, if we didn't have driver's licenses, it was a lot harder to go hang out with a friend. So we spend a lot of time, in our rooms with a TV or our computer, just like scrolling the internet. But it was also a more filtered experience at the time, or at least a little bit more hidden. And so there's like, for me at 30 now, I look back at that time and I'm like, geez, there's a whole lot of like weird societal patriarchy stuff that I consumed through um, interpreted media, right? Like it was a bit more. Oop, looks like we lost Anna for a second. I'm just gonna sort of get her back on. Just give me one moment. I do want to take a moment to point out that this is a internet struggle. This is a very, very real internet struggle that we have here. It's come up before, but you know, it's real, and folks can. I know this is like a quick hop in topic, but folks can definitely please consider to look at the work that Bill Taylor's doing to get internet services better in our area, um, because we need it in order to do this kind of thing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch the splash screen for a minute while I get Anna back up, and we'll just keep going from there. So just hang on, folks, and we'll be right back. All right.
Hello. Can you? Hi.
Yeah, we're back. We're back. We're good. We're good. We made it. We're gonna be okay.
Was having some issues.
Totally okay. It happens. You know, like this is why I always kind of like harp on the we need better internet here tip. But at any rate, we were talking about like the trauma that you guys experience with technology, right? Like,
Ironic.
yeah, I know. It's, you know, here we are. But so I think I was sort of saying like, you know, like there's a really, and this is, I think the point, like one of the points that I wanted to make about like the difference between the experience of say my millennial generation and your Gen Z generation of like the actual media that we're exposed to, right? Like so much of what I was seeing was like heavily produced narrative based stuff. But the significant difference for you guys is that it's very unadulterated and it's very like, oh, here's this random video of this horrible thing happening, and it's almost like watching snuff films every day. And that like that creates two unique problems, right? Like for my generation, it's like, okay, we have to unlearn these sort of weird patriarchal problems that we've sort of been inundated with over and over again. But for you guys, it's different because it's like you have to actually confront the brutal reality of the world every time that this stuff just shows up in your feed. And I like what is that sort of like, what does that psychological impact feel like to have to see that stuff? Like, what's your mental process that you go through when you see that kind of thing? And like, especially as you're, you know, going through a period where your brain is developing and you don't have all the answers. Like, I'm really curious as to what like genuinely that process is like, because I didn't have it, you know what I mean? Like it didn't happen to me until years later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't want to like bring up anything super dark, but I think that example that always comes to mind with my generation is like when I was in middle school, something that was huge on the internet, which I never personally saw, but a lot of people my age did, was the ISIS beheading videos.
Yeah.
If you're familiar, you know, the ISIS journalist beheading videos.
Yep.
Which were available pretty readily on the internet. If you wanted to search for them, I'm sure you could find them now.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of kids saw them because they were all over Facebook. And it was something that became a joke, I think, in my generation, like an ISIS beheading video.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think so many kids saw them and were so deeply horrified at the idea of something like that existing in the world, that the only way it could exist in their minds was as something that was funny, because we were 12 or like 13.
Right.
And I'm even kind of laughing about it now because it's like horrible.
Well, and I think
I think that's what a lot of us, I think my generation gets critiqued a lot for laughing off things that are terrible and horrifying, but it's because we're inundated every day, and even as children we were, with ISIS beheading video number 4.
Yeah. Well, and what do you do?
How do
what
you
do you
cope
do
with
with that? Like,
ever?
yeah. Like, what do you do with that feeling of like it's, you know, like laughing is a defense mechanism. You know what I mean? It's a way that we all will try and sort of push down the super dark feeling that we have, and that's very different than seeing sort of like, you know, Hollywood violence or you know, it's, you know, or like a violent comic, you know, they're two uniquely separate things. And I don't think older generations fully understand that psychological impact on kids who are just trying to get through it. And it speaks to the point of like maybe why things can be so polarizing for young people today. Why that, you know, not that it isn't polarizing for everybody, but that condition throws you into it so early, and then you have to go through this whole process of like, okay, well, I'm literally traumatized by the images I've seen and I don't know what to do about it. I can either retreat into my cave and hate the world and hate my peers, or I can, like just try and numb myself completely, and I can go out and I can just vape up a storm and drive around, or I can get involved in activism. There's like several different avenues that one could go down, but or a combination of them maybe. But it's like that's a heightened experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it creates a view of the world that is incredibly intense. It is really, really heightened compared to somebody who has never been on the internet before. It has more emotion, maybe. I don't know like what exact emotion it is. It's like more danger and more violence, but you also see 1,000,000,000, I don't know, grandma reunited with long lost grandchild videos.
Yeah.
So it's like everything all at once all the time.
Yeah.
And it's very intense.
So I always like the analogy, like drinking from a fire hydrant. You know what I mean? It's like,
yeah.
like and I just like, I always like want to encourage people in my generation or older generations to like, please consider this dynamic that we literally do not understand what it's like to be trying to develop our critical facilities at the same time as being exposed to just like this mountain of intense imagery and audio and discourse. And so I guess that sort of leads into the next question that I have, which is like bullying, right? It's always been an issue. When I was going to school, homophobia and racism were absolutely rampant. Like I was on the receiving end of it as well as the giving end of it many times. It's stuff that I, even to this day, am trying to sort of reckon with and process and find a way to like get comfortable with that discomfort. And hearing you and Jonah speak at recent events really highlighted that like those problems haven't changed. And I think something that really stood out to me that I heard from you guys was that, like you've got people that have, pride flags outside their house and they've got Obama signs, whatnot. And those kids are still going into school and they're still perpetuating the racism and the homophobia and the sexism. And like, because of the proliferation of technology, I know that also sort of heightens the actual space or bubble that bullying can occur in. And, like obviously cyberbullying was like a huge dimension of understanding that happened sort of like towards the end of my experience and became much more prevalent afterwards. And you guys get painted with this really broad brush of like, oh, well, these kids are woke, you know what I mean? Like they understand, they see all this stuff, like what we were just talking about. So there's sort of like a grow up fast kind of dynamic. And those two things for somebody who's older like me almost don't like, they don't mesh. You know what I mean? Like there's not like, or it's hard to understand that sort of like that push pull. And I'm wondering if you can sort of just like shed some light on how that works and how that plays out.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out a lot of this. I think one of the big things is that kids don't talk about bullying in the terms of bullying anymore, because I think that word is really highly commodified by government structures and by school administration structures. When I say commodified, I mean it's put on posters, government presidential campaigns, they do anti-bullying for clout. But when you use bullying realistically, it doesn't really get you anywhere. If you say I'm being bullied, It doesn't do anything for you. And in fact, kids are a lot less likely to take you seriously if you say I'm getting bullied than if you say, you know, Greg is beating me up. Kids say, oh no, Greg shouldn't do that. But if you say Greg is bullying me, kids say, what are you, a loser? Why do you think you're being bullied? It's not a word that's taken very seriously anymore because of the way it's been portrayed in anti-bullying campaigns, I think, as something that's a bit of a joke. And so it's very different now because of the way that it's been. It's been turned into sort of a thing that's very hard to access, and so now I don't really know how to word that.
No, that's okay. I mean, I think that's that in of itself is kind of a good indicator to me that like what I hear you sort of, correct me if I'm wrong because I don't ever want to speak for anybody, but it sounds like you're trying to sort of say that like, look, like when you use the word bullying, you're kind of tokenizing the experience itself. And you're trying to sort of create like a buzzword that puts it into a box and doesn't do justice the actual experience of that student in that moment, what they're literally going through, what they're facing. You know, it's not it doesn't seem totally fair to the students themselves and what that actually is. And I think your point about the sort of like the stigma of it, right? And the way that it just sort of like, now you're getting labeled for being like, why are you being a crybaby, or like whatever the heck people say about it now. You know, it's like, because what you're talking about is more of a dynamic than it is a thing that happens, right? It's like, it's about an interaction or an experience, as opposed to just like, this person is a bully or this person is being bullied. It puts it into a very sort of like black and white dichotomy, and it doesn't really address the holistic nature of needing to deal with the problem itself.
Yeah, oftentimes, I mean, there are times where bullying would be a very appropriate word, but it's just, you see those anti-bullying advertisements from the early 2000s where some kid knocks the books out of another kid's hands and says, you're a nerd. And that's what everybody thinks about, instead of at ConVal, where it's a kid who comes up and spits on you and calls you a slur, and then whatever. That's very different.
Right.
Or a kid who will like actually like seek out specific kids to go and pick fights with in the hallway. Or a kid who everybody is afraid of. Everybody, like every gay kid in the entire school is afraid of that one guy, and we all know why we're afraid of him, but nobody talks about it. That's bullying, but we don't call it that. Because it's also just homophobia, and calling it bullying instead is a little bit reductive, and it doesn't really acknowledge the whole scope of the issue. And I feel like whenever I called it bullying, people just didn't want to take it seriously. But also when I called it homophobia, people definitely didn't want to take it seriously either.
Yeah.
Because we didn't have homophobia at ConVal. It was such an encouraging, inviting environment.
Yeah, that's, you know, that's a tough one. And I think the other dynamic too is that like, when you call a kid a bully, right? When you say you're being a bully, you're also reducing their challenged experience. Like, I knew that like there are kids that I would have absolutely called bullies in my time when I was there. But when I really think about it now, looking back, I'm like, you know what? Those kids had tough experiences outside of school. And in a lot of ways, probably what they were doing was they were trying to work out or deal with or combat those struggles that they were experiencing at home, where they had absolutely no control over their lives or their experiences. And you can go into school and you can say, hey, that kid looks weaker than me, or that kid's smaller, or like, that kid looks more vulnerable. I can exercise control over that. So it's also not dealing with the fact that that bully themselves is also a victim of something. And it's not holistic. Is that would you say that that's that's accurate?
I would say that's generally true. I also think ConVal's discipline system is so inadequate, though, that there were some kids who just liked to intimidate brown, black, queer kids. Like kids who I know for a fact had pretty good home lives. I don't know everything about anybody. But kids whose parents I know them in general, and they just liked to come to school and make kids afraid, I think. And ConVal never dealt with them. ConVal never did anything, even though everybody knew these kids, everybody knew who they were. I'm sure if they're like my peers watching this now, they could say their names. And we were all scared of them all of the time, and nobody ever did anything for us. And I think it was a real problem that never happened, that there was never any sort of mediation between people who were afraid and the people who made us afraid. And that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, and this is now I'm going to ask this. I don't expect like a substantial answer to it because I don't have one myself, but it's like at the very least I want to try and sort of like get the conversation sort of open, and maybe people can think about this as we sit here and sort of struggle to think about it ourselves. It's like, what do you do for those kids? Like, how do you reach those kids or those people? I mean, I think like, again, this sort of comes into like, in an older generation, right? Like I always think I've cited this a number of times, but I remember there being an interview a couple years ago that AOC did with Brianna Joy Gray when Brie was still working for The Intercept, and they did it at South by Southwest, and they were taking questions, and somebody came up and they said, how do you change somebody's mind? And AOC was kind of like, well, your problem is that you're trying to change somebody's mind. Don't do that. Like, like that's the first folly, is like, you're not going to change somebody's mind. They have to change their own mind through whatever. And what you do is you sort of work backwards through your experiences and say, okay, well, we agree on this, but we don't agree on this. And why do we, like, what brought you to your conclusion versus what brought me to my conclusion? What are our personal experiences? And I'm sort of wondering, like, what are your thoughts? Like, what would you have suggested to administration at that time, rather than just, you need to deal with this, right? Like, if someone were to say, well, what kind of constructive criticism would you say, or what kind of suggestion might you have to actually trying to connect with these students who are just genuinely like engaging in what somebody might observe as sadistic behavior?
There's a particular incident that comes to mind. I really like Steve Barch, who's in charge of discipline at ConVal. That's public information. I'm not just like naming names.
Mr. Barch was there when I was there, so yeah.
Yeah, I really like Steve Barch a lot. And there was an incident in which there is a young peer of mine who was dropping homophobic slurs about some of my friends in the library, in not to us, but just in such a loud way that it was like obvious that we would hear it. And so we went to Barch and we told him what was going on, and he invited her to his office, discussed it with her, and then invited us back to the office. And instead of just giving her detention, he asked us, what do you want me to do? Which was a fascinating question to me. It was something that I had never really been asked or had even thought about before. And so what we all agreed upon was, there's no reason to give her detention or suspension over it. We're not really that upset about it. If you could just explain to her why what she did was wrong and that it hurt our feelings, that would be great. But honestly, she's just going to get more upset at us than she already is if you give her detention, because she obviously doesn't like us already.
Right.
And so if you give her detention over something she did to us, she'll probably just get even madder. And I don't really believe in the concept of detention. Regardless, I don't think it does anything for anybody.
I relate to that.
And so what he did was he did exactly that. He like made her sit down with him and explained to her like why calling people slurs is wrong, I guess,
Right.
in a sort of mediated way, and then told her that she wasn't in trouble otherwise and nothing would go on her record. And I never had any issues with her. None of us ever did again. I think that was an interesting way to deal with it. I liked being asked what I thought should be the outcome of the issue.
Mm-hmm.
I would have sat down with her myself, but that wasn't really an option at the time.
Yeah.
And that was sort of a first step in what you might call restorative justice, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Where
That was
where
exactly
nobody
what I was thinking. Like, this is what you're describing to me sounds like sort of the restorative justice model that a lot of the defund movement in a broader context is actually trying to get at. That it's not just in this one space does this work, but in all spaces. It's about how we go about mitigating a real issue.
Yeah, I think it's about creating these spaces where these kids have an opportunity to have it explained to them why what they did was wrong. If the kids who were victimized are willing to sit down with them and really talk to them, that is amazing to me. Obviously, they have no responsibility to do that, but I personally always would have been willing to. And I think it creates, for one, an uncomfortable space for the person who was the perpetrator. And I think the more that you create that uncomfortable space for perpetrators where they have to face the person they victimized one on one, kind of the less they're willing to do it. Because the reason that they yell slurs at you in the hallway is because it's funny.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny and it's a one off thing, and they can just do it without consequences. And if every single time they do it, they have to sit down for an hour with you in Barch's office and talk about why it hurt your feelings, they're going to stop doing it.
Right.
Because it's not fun anymore.
Right.
And it doesn't have consequences for them that goes on their record. It doesn't hurt them in like a larger punitive carceral sense.
Mm-hmm.
It just creates emotional consequences that helps everybody, I think, heal.
Right. Well, and like I hear you say that, and I think to myself, like, okay, I could not count on even two hands the amount of times that I had somebody say to me, well, the way you deal with a bully is you go back and you punch them in the face and then they learn from it, right? Like, and that's very reductive. But there's a certain aspect of like, well, there's a certain truth there, but that's a mischaracterization of the way it's done. And that, in a sense, what the restorative justice model does is it's sort of like the emotional equivalent of that, like taking the victim and giving them the ability to confront in that way what's happening. And it's like, it's almost more like an emotional punch in the face kind of a thing. Like, I'm not saying that it should be done in an attacking way, right? It's always done in a positive way. It's about, using I statements and talking about how we feel and talking, like, this is how I felt when you said this, right? Like, but what that does is it then puts that emotional responsibility back on the person who committed the bullying act and forces them to confront themselves, right? Like much the way that this, like say like a boomer or a Gen Xer would say you punch bully back in the face. It's like what they're really talking about is like that bully needs to physically feel the pain, right? They need to sort of understand that they are causing pain and they will experience pain back upon themselves. And that physical pain doesn't solve anything because it's actually involved in violence. It's not a good way to deal with the problem, like at all. Maybe for some kids that works, I guess, but it's never like that's, again, it just perpetuates a problematic thing, which is literally physical violence, as opposed to dealing with the confrontation of uncomfortable feelings.
And like you were talking about, that space that restorative justice creates, it also opens up a dialogue for the bullier to talk to an administration figure, or if the dialogue is really that open, for the bully to say, I'm dealing with a lot myself.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a place that I can have resources? Is this a space that I can talk about what I'm dealing with personally in my own home life or whatever that is making me act that way, if that is true for them, which again is not always true,
right?
But sometimes.
And I think the other thing that it does too is it promotes emotional maturity, right? Like that's a learning experience in of itself, that we're, if we're really want to be doing a service to our students, right? If we want to make public schools be effective, and like we can't just think about it as book learning, right? Like there's a lot that you learn in a school that doesn't have anything to do with reading a textbook or like doing a homework assignment or taking a test. That emotional maturity is something that we learn during that period of time. And if we're given good models and good sort of like paradigms to actually exercise that, then we can promote the growth of mental maturity and emotional maturity in a positive way that's going to create better changes within our society once students are out of that space, once they go to college, once they go, into the workforce, whatever they decide to do after graduation, that you're actually equipping students with not just the knowledge, but literally how to use the knowledge. Yeah, I don't know if that if you would feel that that's sort of an appropriate characterization of it.
No, I completely agree, because when you teach students how to have dialogue with each other outside of conflict, when you teach them how to resolve conflicts, they're going to bring that ability for conflict resolution to their workspaces, to their college, to their personal lives, their relationships. They bring that conflict resolution ability everywhere, and it helps build peace, healthy relationships. I mean, it's foundational.
Right.
Whereas kids coming out of Great Brook, SMS, ConVal, they're hurting, confused, emotionally stunted, dare I say, on occasion. Where like they just don't know like how to get help, how to ask for it. And there's a lot of fights in these schools, a lot of physical fights, because kids lash out at each other. They don't know how to say, hey, I don't like what you just said. I wish you wouldn't say it to me.
Right.
And so instead they deck each other in front of the main staircase. And then, I mean, that's the rest of all of our days.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that was certainly something that would happen a lot. I mean, even in my time, if fights were definitely a regular enough occurrence. And yeah, that physical reaction, it's like when I'm, I know even to this day when I feel emotional, I feel a need to sort of express myself in a physical way, and it's always really difficult to try and reel that back and control that feeling and not lash out. And it's like like to teach that type of processing at that time in your life. Like I wish that I had been able to interact with this kind of a way to consider things much sooner than I did, because I feel like there are a lot of things that I look back on my, the past, when the 13 years of my life, and I'm like, man, there's a lot of things I probably would have handled much better if I had been exposed to a more restorative justice type of model, as opposed to, okay, you just got bullied really hard. We're going to take you out of class for the rest of the day and we're going to let you hang out. And then like some teachers will talk to these other kids and tell them what they did was wrong. And then we'll just go back to the same old the next day,
Mm-hmm. Well, that's another good point as well, is that I was a lot of the times friends with the kids who got bullied, not the bulliers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times it was my friends that got pulled out of class, not the bullies. It
Right.
was my friends who were put in the guidance counselor's office or the nurse's office, or they got told to transfer classes because it was more than one bully. It was 5 bullies in their geometry class.
Yeah.
And so instead of transferring 5 bullies out of your geometry class, it's easy to transfer 1 gay kid out of the geometry class.
Right.
But then you're just playing geometry hopscotch, because there's always going to be bullies in your math class. And so it's about finding the math class with what the least amount of death threats in it.
Well, and it also
a nightmare.
In a way re-victimizes that gay student or that LGBTQ student or that trans student, that black student. Because they're now the one that has to be dealt with by the system, right? Like
exactly.
you're sanctioning the the negative behavior by just like letting those kids stay in class, and there's not that repercussion, whereas this individual student now has to deal with the fact that they missed a day of classes. They now have to catch up. They might have to do more homework. So you're just creating more work for that one individual student that's already struggling. Whereas there's not sort of like, there's no load sharing. So I think, that's a really, really, really important point that you brought up right there. And I really appreciate that was something that you touched on, because I think that's super, super pivotal to the discussion. Is that sort of like broader picture, like what just happened, like if we like objectively try and look at it, like literally what did we just do? Who did we help? Who did we, encourage by way of action? It's like, I'm thinking about like a sort of parallel experience that I had last night was, in the housing task force, we're sort of, talking about like, as I'm in the middle of this trying to find a new housing situation for myself, and I hear, older members of the town who own their own houses, and they're saying things like, well, with everything going on right now, it's, there's all this stuff happening in our society and all of these intense conversations, and just, housing's just not really on my mind. I'm more worried about how am I going to get back to work. And my response was like, look, like, you can say you sit here and you care. You can say you sit here and you're not trying to say that a type of person isn't who you want in the community. But when you say, I don't have time or the space to deal with that, or we're talking about just policy, it's like you're ignoring the lived experience of somebody else. You're not accounting for what about the person who has to go through all the things that you're going through and deal with potential homelessness. Like, that's much like saying that, I'm not to equate them because they're not equal, but that's much like saying, I don't see color or I don't see racism, like we're not racist here. It's like, well, yeah, we are, because your actions are speaking, not your words. The actions of a school administration are, by taking that one student out, are reinforcing the exact paradigms that are problematic. So, yeah, sorry I sort of ranted there on that for a minute.
No, I agree. It was important. I'm just like, I'm thinking and processing.
No, it's okay. I mean, and that's like, I always try to say, like, that's like the whole point of this stream and this like the live show itself, is to like actually try and unpack some of this stuff. It's one thing to read an article in the Ledger transcript, which, like, I appreciate that resource. And I also, however much I appreciate or do not appreciate Facebook comment threads, like, none of this really ever touches on the deeper conversation of actually getting into it and trying to think it really all the way through. So that's something I always want to try and provide a space where we can deal with that. And even if it means that we have sort of like an awkward pause in the middle of this, that's not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. So, sort of I guess the last thing that I kind of wanted to touch on here, and we've already kind of we've bopped past it a couple times, but so I personally have relationships and friendships with teachers who work at ConVal right now, whether they were my teachers that I became friends with after I graduated, or they're literally my classmates that went and got they went and got a degree that allows them to go back and teach public school, and they're working at ConVal now. Like, I know that they experience the labor pressures that we talked about earlier, and things can often get sort of out of hand or too big for the resources that they have at their disposal to really deal with the problems. And they're also not necessarily equipped, because they're there to like teach math or teach social studies or whatever, right? Like that's like literally their job is to educate students on on basic knowledge that you need to have, but they also have to deal with that interpersonal dynamic. And I'm just, where do you feel the pressure would be best applied from the perspective of a former student, graduate, on this system? Like where, like how much of this is on teachers versus how much of this is like an administrative issue? How can we help teachers, aside from paying them more, as we discussed, to have what they need? You know, I mean, I know that, like, and this might touch on like a taxation issue somewhere along the way of like, how do we actually pay for schools, which is a huge separate issue in this state. And like the other thing I want to say is like teachers, obviously, like the caveat is teachers aren't a monolith, that every teacher has a different style of teaching within the confines of like their legal requirements as teachers, that, you know, might work for some students but not for others. So you have, you know, some teachers that are really effective for some students but then alienate several others, and then you might have a different teacher that literally is being effective and alienating to like the opposite set, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm just sort of wondering where your perspective on that is at.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is that like it should none of this, as far as mental health goes, should ever be on teachers. Teachers at ConVal already do a therapist's job. So many of them. I loved my teachers at ConVal, but the burden that they have put on them interpersonally with students, a lot of them take it on very willingly, and I admire that a lot. And the relationships that I had with my teachers, as far as, you know, talking to them, having them advise me, was so important, and I valued it. But a lot of teachers were asked to bite off a little bit more than they could chew, I think, because of how poor the mental health services were and because of how unstable some students were. At any given time, teachers are asked to take on what I would call an unreasonable burden. And I would never ask, you know, like a teacher to be the one who is taking on, I guess, the task of maintaining students' mental health. As far as where I think pressure should be applied, to me, it is always as citizens and as parents, as whoever, making it really clear to the school board, whether that's email, calling, and to school administration. You can email, you can call them, it's really easy to find their emails. Telling them, I support ConVal teachers, I support ConVal students. Whatever they tell you that they want, give it to them. Spend my money, my taxpayer money, on the school budget on what they tell you that they want. Because a lot of the times when you're a teacher, when you're a student at ConVal, they tell you, the administration, school board tells you, well, the money in the budget is for this, the money in the budget is for that, we don't have the money in the budget for this, we can't reallocate it, the taxpayers won't support it, they won't vote for it if it's in the budget. That's all you hear, like, all the time. Yeah. And so it's about, as taxpayers, saying, no, I will support it. If the kids want it, then give it to them.
Right. Well, and that's like, that right there gets into the, and I mean, like, it's the same way when you're dealing with like town politics too, right? Or even broader politics, because oftentimes, like, you know, like, okay, so example, I had filed a Freedom of Information Act request to get like the past 20 years of use of force, right? And the cops came back to me and they were like, well, you realize that means that everybody, like that's every time we put handcuffs on a person. I'm like, yeah, that's exactly the stuff I want to see. You know, I realize that we're talking thousands of documents, right? And I'm going into the townhouse and I'm trying to figure out, like, okay, well, like, can I get the, like, you guys are charging me 50 cents a page for this, like, to get a copy of it? Like, do you guys have a digitized version? Can you give me a PDF? And it's like, well, no, we don't do that. Like, you know, and And so the onus then becomes on me to like, all right, I got to download a scanner app for my phone, and I have to figure out a way to sit down and get all of this stuff digitized. And then I'm the one doing that work, right? But that's because it's like the town itself is like, well, this is just our limit. This is legally what we like. That's not our job. And it's important for us to remember that like we get to tell them what their job is, right? Like we make that decision, we make that call. And it's on us to sort of like unfortunately, in many ways, because of the way that we've set everything up, because we've sort of like, we live in this democracy, but realistically it's gotten so far away, and we haven't acknowledged how much of a role education and awareness of the public is necessary for actual democracy to work. Like you know, like, because how can somebody know something that they don't know? You know what I mean? Like so we have to make sure that people have the tools, and also that they have the time to go through it, right? And in many ways, it's about re-educating the voter base, whether it's, you know, in the town or for the school board, to say, no, you have, like, we as people need to go do the research and figure out exactly what we need to demand of the school board, so we can put down specific line items and say, this is how you're going to do it from here on out. And I think that's like, I always think about how like that's the intersection, right? If, you know, intersectionality comes up a lot. That's the intersection of policy and experience, right? Like that's where that relationship between like the reason I'm like, we would say defund the police is because it's not a negative, right? It's about, we want something positive, and we see that there's limited resources, and we feel like potentially right now we're not allocating our resources to the proper location. And so it's not a negative to say we want to take away from that. It's more like, well, is this serving us well? Is what we have right here actually serving our purpose, or do we maybe need to reassess and come up with a different solution to the problem?
One of the things that Reagan Riffle, who put out that public letter to the school board, pointed out, that was really, it was a really good point that I really wanted to bring up as well, is that the ConVal school board budget often includes things like speakers, like recycled percussion, which nobody at ConVal likes, and a drug prevention budget, drug use prevention, which is often very centered on vaping prevention. And if you go to ConVal, you'll see a lot of posters, which often are handmade, and they say things, you know, avocado don't vape in the bathrooms is one that really sticks in my memory. And they're all very centered on shaming kids out of vaping. ConVal did a big study to figure out essentially how many kids at ConVal vape, how many kids don't, how many kids smoke, how many kids don't, how many kids do crack, how many kids don't. And there's a bunch of signs around that say, you know, 99% of kids at ConVal don't do cocaine. 40% of kids at ConVal don't vape. So you shouldn't either. And it's all designed to shame kids out of doing vape. I sound so old. Out of juuling, out of buying pods from each other, out of all of that kind of stuff. But it doesn't work. It doesn't work because kids at ConVal are super, super addicted, like so addicted to tobacco, to nicotine, all of that stuff. They're really, really, really addicted to it, to be honest. It's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And so you can't shame kids out of a chronic nicotine addiction. Has never been how it works. And so to encourage the school board to instead change budget line items from drug prevention, money for like studies about how many kids vape so that they can make weird posters, to mental health services, which addresses the reason that kids vape. Kids vape because they're depressed, anxious, they want to lose weight. These are all reasons that a kid might vape. They don't like, I don't know. There's this attitude that kids vape for fun, which I suppose some kids just love to have popcorn lung, but most kids do it because they are anxious, and it calms you down. They're anxious, they're sad, they don't have anything to do for fun, and it makes you feel good. And so it's a very normal habit to pick up when you're sad. Smoking, I would think that most boomers and older generations would understand that. So replace that smoking, etc. prevention budget with a mental health budget, and I think the vaping problem will go away.
Yeah. Well, and I think, you know, like something that I always like, when I was a student at ConVal, right? Like that was a big part of the reason we would say like, okay, well, we're all like driving around smoking weed, and we're like, you know, vaping wasn't a thing when I was there, but like a lot of us developed a smoking habit. Like a lot, you know, like I knew a lot of kids that would like get into smoking cigarettes. It's just like a way to like deal with the stress. You know what I mean? Like it was just like it was some sort of measure of control. Again, a measure of control that you could take over your own experience as a way to sort of self-soothe. And and I think the reason that was so difficult is because we weren't necessarily offered a whole lot of options on what we could do or how we could spend our time or how we could be engaged, right? Like, I mean, I think in large part because there was a certain, like, there's, you know, you're going through that time in your life, and there's also this like anti-authority aspect of things, and very much so like the idea of extracurriculars can feel like, well, you're doing this to, you know, look better for your college application. And like, it's like, okay, so this is just part of the same system that's like pissing me off every day. You know what I mean? And it's not giving me the tool that I need to actually feel like I'm part of my community. And I know that like there was a community conversation that occurred a while back, literally on this topic. And I remember, I think it was Daisy Young was talking about at that meeting, was talking about like, look, like kids are bored and we need something to do. And I never heard, I didn't go to that meeting, and I didn't get a chance to sort of like hear like a recording of it or anything like that, but it sounded like she just kind of got shut down by a lot of the older population. Yeah. So can you tell me about that a little bit?
It was not a productive meeting. I wouldn't call it a productive meeting. Basically Daisy Young, me, and then Henry Bernstein. I really don't want to butcher his last name, but I believe that's his last name. We were all current ConVal students at the time, and Daisy organized a meeting with Karen Hatcher. And the intent of it was to focus in on this issue that young people in Peterborough, specifically in Peterborough and these sort of more rural surrounding towns, don't have specific activities to do. You know, in Keene, they have a movie theater, they have a lot of restaurants, they have things you can go and do, they have shopping, right? Mm-hmm. But in Peterborough, unless you want to eat at a very expensive restaurant that's out of the price range of most high schoolers who work for $7.25 an hour, there is nothing to do. And so instead, you know, you could drive to Merrimack Cinemagic and pay $16 for a movie, but a pack of Jewel Pods is also $16, and you don't have to pay for gas. So which one is more appealing?
Yeah,
right?
And you can just go home and watch Netflix too. Like, you know, like it's like, why? Yeah, and we totally did drive out to Cinemagic. I don't know how many times. You know, like I remember, was it like going to see like Superbad with like, you know, 20 of my classmates when it came out, because all flipping out. But like,
and also when you do that, when you drive all the way to Merrimack, you're not participating in the local economy. You're not, you know, shopping local, whatever. Like you're not staying in town. You're like driving out to the middle of nowhere. It's just like a whole thing. And also it's annoying to drive 45 minutes. Most teens can't drive. When you're a freshman or sophomore in high school, you can't drive. There's so many different factors in it that are just...
And then it'll flip back around on you by the people in the town that say, well, you're not spending your money here. Well, and it's like, yeah, you're not giving me a choice. Like,
yeah, where am I supposed to spend my money?
Right. You know, and it's like, well, if you're not going to engage in the community, why do you want to stay here? You know what I mean? If everything that you can do is isolated to your bedroom and through the internet, then why even stay in this community? You could just go to a different community and do it there. And it's like, well, yeah, but you're now alienating young people. You know,
And the
you're
feedback we sort of received was, well, you could have joined Boy Scouts, which was confusing to me personally.
yeah.
Uh,
Oh,
and a lot of other similar feedback about Scouts programs for different genders in the area. And then like national parks programming, parks and recreation programming in general,
yeah, like
which of
that's so
course is just
vague.
it's just not what people are looking for.
Right.
We suggested a lot of stuff like what the Avenue A Teen Center does in Antrim. I will
Yes.
always plug that program. I honestly have never gone to a lot of the stuff they do, but I know I have so many friends that do. I have so many friends that go to the writing program that the Avenue A Teen Center puts on. They do voter registration. They do nights where you can just go get pizza there. That is such a cool program that Antrim has. It's just kind of a drive for me to go to Antrim from where I live.
Sure.
I know I have so many friends who live in Antrim that go to that place. It's so cool. I'm so mad that Peterborough doesn't have something that's like the Avenue A Teen Center.
Well, okay, so just like, and this is actually like, full disclosure, I actually just recently started working for Max Makerspace, doing community management work there. And one of the first things that I wanted to try and hone in on, especially because there's been a lot of teen suicide in the past several years, and we had at Max, there was an experience that I'm not going to get too into it, but we were very close to one of those incidents, and it really affected a lot of our community members. And one of the things that I've spoken with Roy Schlieben, the director, we've spoken with other members of the community, and that's something that we wanted to try and sort of like figure out a way to create availability in Peterborough, and look at that model of what Avenue A is doing, and look at sort of like, working with them, partnering with other people to try and find a way to create better spaces like that, where, like, where we can just engage with teens. And I mean, like, one of the bonuses, I think, to Max Makerspace, again, full disclosure, I work there, so I'm probably going to like plug it a little bit, but is kind of the fact that there's a training aspect. There's like we're going to give you something to do. You know what I mean? And not just something to do as a hobby, but we're also going to try and figure out a way to help you consider that within the trajectory of your life, and help you see it as a professional end. But it's also just like, it's about having fun, and it's about just enjoying your life's experience and doing something that means something to you, and accomplishing a real goal that is going to create such a better sense of gratification than getting jewel pods. Like, so I think, like, for my part, like, I hear that, I'm now looking around the community and trying to see, like, okay, what are ways that, like, I, with whatever position I have, can do about that? Who can I talk to? And that's not something I'm asking you about. That's just sort of like questions I ask myself on a daily. But it's like, it's good to hear from youth in the area saying, this is what actually works, right? Like, this is like what actually makes a difference to us. And so, like, for whoever's watching this, like, it's my hope that we can all consider it in that different lens. Like, I think something that you've done today is provide a really good setup for understanding, like, what kind of different ground can we work off of that's a bit more stable and not like quicksand. So
Yeah, I think really what teenagers just want is like space that's theirs. At the high school, a space that's safe, that has a real professional that they know they can trust, that doesn't change every few years.
Yeah.
Even though I know it might seem a little utopian to expect that. But just like a room that has someone in there that you can trust, that isn't also in the guidance counselor's office.
Right.
And in town, a place that you can go and you can do arts and crafts or something,
Yeah.
and you can go to like writing programs, and you can eat pizza. And it seems a little kiddish. It might seem like I got that feedback once that that sounds like something for little kids, but teenagers like that. I would go to that
Yeah.
totally. A place where I could do arts and crafts and hang out and eat pizza.
Right.
Um, I think it's just about like making space for teenagers in town because Peterborough feels like a place for old people.
Yep. Yes, it
And so
does.
creating specific teenager, young people minded spaces that are for us, it will vastly improve like the mental well-being, I
Awesome.
think.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, before we take off here, I just sort of like you show quite amount of like quite a bit of promise as far as being an activist, a vocal member of society. And I'm just like, what are your next steps right now? Like, where are you going from here? You know, it's like I'm just curious to see like, hey, we're creating these voices in our communities, and we're encouraging folks like you to do their thing. And I want to sort of like, where are you going? Like, what are you doing next?
Really specifically, I am online next semester. So I'm just Peterborough is so stuck with me because I'm gonna be here. In general, in my life, I go to school for political science. I'd like to run for office, I think. Um, I don't know. I like to make sure that I like this town, Peterborough, Hancock. I'm from Hancock, to be really clear, but like I grew up in Peterborough and stuff. Um, or I didn't grow up in. I've always lived in Hancock. That's such a confusing way to word it.
No, I mean I know what you're saying, because we
Yeah,
all like the way that our high school is and the way things are, that it's like we have this sort of like multi-town unity that we
yeah. I just
experience.
like I like these towns, and I like to hold them accountable. I guess because sometimes I just want to always feel like I could live here one day.
Yeah.
And I want to feel like this could be a place that I could come back to. But right now, there's no housing I could live in. There's no jobs I could have
Right.
that is subway. Like
Yeah.
it's just not a place that I could come back to after college unless I make it one right now.
Yes. And like it's that is so uniquely my experience too. You know, like I just like, as you know, as a 30-year-old, like hearing you say that, like that's exactly how I felt. And I have people that are my age, you know, like I think Zach Green is one of them. You know, like there are a number of people that I know that are like, I love this place and I want to be here because I love this place, and there's something about it that draws me to it. I love the land. I love the, you know, like just the vibe. And I think like we really do feel a sense of, like, we as younger people do, whether it's, you know, from 30 to 10, you know, like we feel a sense of connection to this area. And we want so badly to not be alienated from it and to be welcome into it and to have that be a part of this community. And it's like, and I think, like, you know, when we're out here doing what we're doing, we're not saying, you know, we hate you or we think you're wrong. It's like we see an opportunity to be inclusive and to allow these younger, more diverse voices to be a part of our system and to be a part of our community, and to really holistically consider that as one with it. And while we may say stuff that's really challenging and can make people in charge feel like they're on their back foot and they have to figure things out and they get defensive, like, okay, but that's not, it's not because we don't like you. You know what I mean? Like, it's not because we're trying to fight. It's, you know, we're not looking for a problem. We just we just don't feel that we have the connection echoed back to us that we feel like we're offering up, I guess.
Yeah, I know. I think people sometimes find some of the stuff I say, scary or controversial, but it's not because I like hate this place and I want to tear it down. It's me desperately trying to carve out a place for myself and for others in a place that I already consider my home.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And I don't want to have to lose that and move to the city or somewhere where
Yeah.
because it's the only place I could go.
Yeah. I feel that, and I'm totally on the same page as you, despite the space between us and in our life experiences. Like that one is definitely shared. So Anna, thank you so much for coming on and talking today. This was really awesome. And maybe we can hook up again and do another one at some point when like there's just more to talk about and we've, had changes and things and just sort of see where we're all at like in a little while,
Definitely. Thanks for having me again. This was great.
Yeah. So hey, you have a great day and we'll catch up soon and I look forward to doing more work with you going down the line. So
yeah.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Bye.
All right, everybody. So that was Anna McGuiness. Really, like that was a good conversation. I felt, that's the type of conversation I want to try and have here. So back next week. I definitely have some sort of just like piled up footage, little like clips and previous stuff that I think I'm going to try and release to the patrons a little ahead of time so everybody can sort of enjoy this backlog of video stuff that I got and just became sort of too overwhelmed to get all the edits done. My own personal life has been a bit crazy lately, so it's been a little bit of a challenge to make everything happen at once, and I've sort of had a lot of balls in the air. But this is important stuff, and I personally feel a commitment to keep going. For anybody that feels like they want to support this channel, support what I'm doing here, you can head over to patreon.com/locally sourced. You can follow us on Twitter at locally SRSDNH. You can also hop down here and hit the subscribe button, little bell notification button. Will give you updates whenever we go live, whenever we've got something new going on. And so, it's like, again, this is completely supported by the community. I don't have big backers. I don't have corporate support. There's nothing, you know what I mean? It's just people that care about this stream that I decided to host on a weekly, especially after COVID started. So I'm really excited to keep this going, and I just, huge thank you to everybody that's shown support to this channel, that's come out, that's watched our videos, that's hit that subscribe button, that decided to become a patron. You keep this moving, and I really hope to just see this platform continue to expand as time goes forward. So thanks again, everybody. We'll catch you next week. Later.